highly complex, very passionate subject, really large number of people trying to make the world as they view it, turn it into a much better place. But it's been highly politicized. There are, as we speak today, some 40 different kinds of guidance as to how you comply with ESG in different regions, different countries. The European Union has put huge amounts of money into producing sensible, clear, well thought out policies, which when they've tried to implement has caused huge headaches for compliance departments and investors. I'm thinking here of their categorization of various investment funds, 6, 8, and 9, for those of you with a specialism in the area, where because the guidance was unclear, perhaps rolled out slightly too fast, large numbers of funds have had to be recategorized as to what kind of ESG compliant funds they actually are over the last 18 months. And now the European Union is thinking about, did we go too far with the level of prescription that we have put in with funds with ESG? Now, all of that is then played against the geopolitical interests of the USA, particularly the geopolitical interests of China. We don't have time to go into the Belt and Road Initiative and what they're actually doing and how they're doing it. But all of these have big impacts on what are happening on countries and their major financial institutions. If you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, you actually are probably slightly better off than one of the large multinationals, like one of the large multinational banks, who signed up to some very strong carbon reduction footprint type targets, and then find out nobody is actually financing restocking the military, or nobody's actually financing horrible basic things like diesel refineries, because these are the new wicked targets. And then within the last 12 months, Vladimir does his bit for world peace, and all of a sudden you actually need to have diesel cracking facilities in your own country, because you need to run a modern country, you need reliable power. So I think ESG is going to have a huge impact on what we do in the fin crime area, but not necessarily for the reasons that the most ardent ESG supporters think. I think everybody agrees nobody likes watching elephants being butchered for their ivory. And yet, until you can control corruption in certain countries and the demand for that product in others, it's going to carry on, which means you're going to need to arm people to stop the bad guys doing it. All these sorts of things have not, in my view, been thought out. There's a lot of talk around it. There's a lot of new regulations. There's a lot of new shiny specialist departments going, we're looking at international animal trafficking. Well, that's all very nice of you, unless you're actually going to stop the primary market. And I don't think most countries have the nerve to even try that. What are we doing?
Well,
are we just making work?
We are seeing in the countries where it originates, where the animals that are stolen from, poached, whatever, we are seeing massive efforts about that, absolutely enormous efforts. But having said that, those enormous efforts are dwarfed by the amount of criminals that are conducting the problems. I have a question that is perhaps a little off topic. It's not really, but it might appear so. Who benefits from putting together the environmental, the social, and the governance aspects instead of treating them separately? Who actually makes the money? Because it's all about money. It's always about money. Who makes the money? The answer, in my humble view, is probably the large consultancies that are driving the legislation and the large consultancies that are then saying, we will come and help you set up your policies. Am I unduly cynical?
It's also the large consultancies. Sorry, it's also the large consultancies. They do not know what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the countries. They are just sitting in their ivory towers, building policies that no one can understand. That would be my take on it.
I agree. Des has not been part of the last 5 minutes. So we were talking about whether or not having environmental, social, and governance as one topic, who benefits from that? And the second part of that question is, what would society benefit from separating them and treating each one individually? So we say the social stuff that's dealing with the child labor, slave labor, and all the other things that we do need to deal with, and they are distinct from environmental issues. I can see great advantage in separating them.
Well, this comes back to, this was set by the UN 17 SDGs back in 2016 in Paris. You look at them, it is a universal solution for everything.
Which means
world poverty, world hunger. Yeah. Now, there are certain things that you can actually, as financial institutions, do. There are certain things that global financial institutions have set up and are driving a desire for ESG assets, to creating a market. The problem you've got is the mouth too big? Are they writing checks that they actually can't cash, in my view? And the big issue that sits around that is you have created a demand for ESG assets, quite rightly so. And there are quite a lot of decent people who want to make the world a better place, which as soon as you actually reintroduce a real value for borrowing interest rates, in other words, you actually start to get to more normalized interest rates rather than let's print money over the last 15 years, you start going, actually, can we make any returns on this? And that's where we are right now, in my view. Des.
Following up on that, definitely, and again, I may sound too overly critical of it because you're asking good questions, is that a lot of the ESG is driven by political agendas within the countries nowadays, which is number one issue for me, as always. The second point that I'd like to make before I pass you back to Julia would be just a question. Really, every ESG statement that I've read or seen lacks one thing, and it seems to be humility. It just doesn't work. It's just everybody telling what wonderful things we're doing, X, Y, and Z, but I think ESG is lacking humility in the statements that are out there. Julia? I
think it's not lacking humility, but lacking the human touch. I suspect that quite a lot of the ESG statements out there could have come from ChatGPT, or before the advent of ChatGPT. I could have Googled and put something onto my corporate report, and that came from Google.
I think that the comment that we had a few minutes ago, that this is driven internally by internal politics. I've got a feeling that what's happening is that it's being driven by politicians who are anxious to get the youth or the under 35 vote. And because this is a big topic on social media by people who have no real experience in the world, to be honest, they feel they have to pander to that in the same way as we see pandering to religious groups and others across the whole world. It's not unusual for governments to pander to self-appointed interest groups. But I wonder whether the idea that you can run around and chain yourself to or glue yourself to the road as a means of influencing policy I wonder whether that is the generation that this policy is really aimed for, rather than paying attention to how it can operate in practice. I'm not decrying the concept. I agree. There's a lot that needs to be done, but are we doing it the right way, Mark?
Gosh, no, not in the UK. We are now providing within the UK the most expensive power in the EU, if we're still a member. We have no backup facilities, and we have a government and departments that are so stupid that they thought dynamiting the old coal power stations for one of the previous COPs was a good idea. Now, the world has changed in the 2 years since that has occurred. And it didn't strike either Whitehall, the opposition, or the government that actually that could happen. On top of it, as electric vehicles are rolled out or not being rolled out, as Ford cut 12 billion of investment, as GM cut investment, as BMW cut investment, nobody who's an individual, or rather, sorry, too few people are buying electric vehicles because of the restrictions that they have. And by the way, nobody's got an electric vehicle, refuse vehicle to work yet, or lorries to work yet, or even delivery vans, which don't restrict the amount of business that you can do. And governments are half-assing the implementation yet again. So one of the issues, for example, electric vehicles, perfectly sensible thing to do, as long as you don't mind the ethics of exploiting people in Africa with slave-like conditions while they're mining cobalt. As long as you don't mind not investing in fire safety or suppression equipment, so that you're now having the Australian government saying we don't want EVs on our ferries, or we're going to have to put all sorts of controls on that sort of thing. And nobody is talking about it in the UK. Luton Airport went up in a Luton Airport car park went up. And this has been attributed to a diesel car. When you look at the video, it looks like it could have been a diesel hybrid car that was burning, nobody could put out, and then the entire car park goes up. Now, that's the second time we think it's happened in the UK, but the government's not addressing it. Because actually you have to put all kinds of new fire suppression systems in. EVs, when they go, it's rare, but when they do, they produce a whole series of toxic environment, toxic gases, and they're self-feeding as flames. They will actually relight over a period of 2 or 3 days. And the costs associated with that, you're seeing come through the insurance market first, where EV insurance vehicle rates are going up, and nobody who's an individual is willing to pay the loss on the depreciated value or the ever-increasing cost of, the most expensive electricity in the UK being put into the cars.
I've also noted the price of a new electric vehicle relative to the price of the equivalent model petrol car is as much as 30% higher. Now, that cannot all be attributable to the batteries. That's got to be attributable to profiteering by the companies who are they are able to lobby the governments to get their product up. We shouldn't be using electric vehicles. It's a very, very poor technology on every possible level, from the mining the cobalt to trying to get rid of the batteries at the end of the day. It's all a bad technology. And we should be looking at hydrogen if we want an alternative to petrol, because it's clean, it's quick, it's cheap, and it's easy.
I think, can I just come in on that? EVs, electric vehicles, the use of batteries within those things, it's not a new concept in the UK, because being an old codger, I kind of remember the milkman coming round every day.
Yep.
So what do we do? What's changed apart from maybe the speed? I don't know.
No, for me, let me just very quickly get in here for a moment, Nigel, and just say, it's not often you'll hear me defend large multinationals. In this case, I'm going to. They're not profiteering. Because one of the things that's happened since the world economy has opened up again is inflation has taken off like a scalded cat, because actually you can't print money till the cows come home and not expect inflation to go off. And the electricity, the cost of which is not being subsidized as much, the price of steel, oh, that's expensive when you've got really expensive electricity. All these things that have been happy talked into, we can do this, we are a new generation, is beginning to come home to roost. And that's the problem. We've set unrealistic targets with unrealistic wishing of technology that doesn't work as efficiently as we want yet. And before I start rabbiting on, I'm going to hand back to Julia and say, what do you think, Julia?
I'm going to interrupt because I'm the only one who really knows about this stuff, because my father and my uncle decided that they would put a gas engine, liquid natural gas, into a bus, and they found a Rolls-Royce engine used for military purposes, or would have been, lurking in the corner of a shed at Rolls-Royce in Crewe, and they put it in a bus with the agreement of the bus operator that my father worked for, the agreement of Rolls-Royce. And this was at a time when there was the fuel crisis in the 1970s, and the then Labour government sponsored the gas bus because it was going to be a solution. Then petrol prices came down, oil prices came down, and the then Labour government said, we don't need it anymore. And the project was abandoned. But that was in 1972, 73, something like that. And it was a very, very useful project. We then saw 15, nearly 20 years later, in California, a very similar project was launched. And then India has a number of gas buses running now. I don't think that natural gas is actually a viable way of fueling everybody's cars. I think that hydrogen is much better, but it is available, and it's been used in taxis in Malaysia for decades. But the fuel consumption is quite poor, so they spend a lot of time queuing for refills. But there are alternatives to electric vehicles which are better, and they are more, to use that awful word, sustainable, in that the infrastructure is needed. But once the infrastructure is in, it's a lot easier to, it's a lot more affordable to produce the power. Okay, Julia, back to you for a wrap up because we've run out of time.
First, I would say we don't know what we don't know. There are a lot of considerations as well, politics being one of them. And I would like to wrap up to say that this is not about giving a solution, but to encourage everyone who looks into ESG to consider all the factors that are involved before we decide on any of the steps, including criticizing any particular nation or communities for doing what they are doing.